The sea around the island of Svolder was calm in September of the year 1000. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway stood on the deck of his flagship, the Long Serpent. It was the largest warship in the north, with 34 pairs of oars. Olaf was confident he was sailing home with his fleet, but he had sent most of his ships ahead. He kept only 11 of his best vessels with him. He was a king who enjoyed a grand entrance. He did not know his enemies were waiting for him. A coalition had formed against him. King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, King Olaf Skotkonung of Sweden, and the Norwegian Jarl Erik Hakanarsson. They hated Olaf. They had combined their fleets, a massive force, and hidden them behind the island. Their plan was simple. They would use Olaf's pride against him. As Olaf's small squadron sailed past the island, a few Danish ships appeared. They were large, but not overwhelming. One of Olaf's men pointed them out. Olaf laughed. He was not afraid of Danes. He ordered his men to prepare for battle, but he was not worried. Then a few Swedish ships appeared. Again, Olaf was dismissive. He believed his men and his ships, especially the Long Serpent, were superior to any others. He was known for this kind of thinking. It had served him well in the past. It would not serve him now. His advisors grew nervous. They urged caution. They suggested that the main fleet sailing far ahead should be called back. Olaf refused. He would not show fear. He would not run. Like, that was the core of his identity. Like, his enemies knew this. They had counted on it. Then Jarl Erik's ships came into view. Leading them was the Iron Ram. It was a huge vessel, reinforced with iron along its prow. It was a ship built not just for fighting, but for intimidation. Seeing it, Olaf finally understood. He had been tricked. The small groups of ships were bait. The full combined might of his enemies was now emerging from its hiding place, cutting off his path forward and his path of retreat. His 11 ships were now facing more than 70. The psychological blow landed before the first arrow was fired. Olaf's famous confidence evaporated. His men saw it. They felt the trap close around them. The casual arrogance that had defined their king was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a hopeless fight. The battle had already been half lost in his mind. The enemy had used his own character as a weapon against him. It was a quiet, brutal, and effective piece of warfare. They did not just attack his ships, they attacked his mind first. Number 19, they made you think the devil was in the fog. It was June 8th, 793. The island of Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria in England was a place of quiet prayer. The monks there knew little of war. Their world was one of manuscripts, psalms, and the steady rhythm of the tides. They were a center of Christian learning for Northern Europe. They believed their isolation and their faith protected them. That morning, the fog was thick. The sea and the sky were a single gray wall. Then shapes began to emerge from the mist. They were long, slender ships. At the prow of each vessel was a carved head, a dragon, a serpent. The monks had never seen anything like them. The ships moved with a strange speed and silence, propelled by a single large, square sail and rows of oars that dipped into the water with unsettling unity. These ships, the long ships, were a key to Viking terror. They were engineering marvels. They had a shallow draft, meaning they could sail in water only a few feet deep. A normal European trading vessel or warship needed a deep harbor. A long ship could land on almost any beach. It could also sail up rivers deep into the heart of a country far from where anyone expected an attack from the sea. To the monks of Lindisfarne, the ships did not look like they came from another country. They looked like they came from another world. They appeared out of the fog without warning, grounding on the sand as if they were born of the sea itself. There was no time to send for help. There was no time to organize a defense. One moment there was peace. The horned figures were running towards the monastery. The attackers were not just there to steal gold and silver. They were there to shatter an idea. The idea that a holy place was safe. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of the time, described the event with dread. It spoke of fiery dragons seen flying in the air and a great famine that followed. The chroniclers were trying to make sense of something that seemed supernatural. How could men appear from the sea like that? The psychological impact on England and the rest of Christian Europe was immense. This was not a normal act of war. It was a violation. Alcuin of York, a leading scholar who was from the region, wrote letters expressing his horror. Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, he wrote. He questioned how this could happen to a place as holy as Lindisfarne. He framed it as a divine punishment. The Vikings who raided Lindisfarne did not need to know the complex theology of their victims. They just needed to understand fear. Their arrival was deliberately shocking. They used the weather and the capabilities of their ships to create an aura of the supernatural. They were not just soldiers, they were omens, they were monsters from the fog. This first major raid established a reputation that would last for centuries. The story was told and retold, and with every telling, the fear grew. The Vikings were no longer just men from the north. They were a force of nature, as unpredictable and as terrifying as a storm. Number 18, they wore the bear's skin to become the bear. And Harold Fairhair was trying to unite Norway in the late 9th century. It was a bloody business. Dozens of petty kings and local jarls stood in his way. To win, Harold needed more than just soldiers. He needed a weapon that could break the will of his enemies before the shield walls even met. He had such a weapon. They were called berserkers. One of these men was named Bjorn. He was a large man, even for a Norseman. But his size was not what made him frightening. It was what he did before a battle. While other warriors checked their mail, sharpened their axes, and formed up in disciplined lines, Bjorn and the other berserkers would begin their transformation. He would start with a low growl, a sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest. He would work himself into a frenzy. He would bite the iron rim of his shield, leaving teeth marks in the metal. His eyes would glaze over. He would howl, not like a man, but like a wolf or a bear. He wore a bear's pelt, with the head of the beast pulled over his own like a hood. In the chaos of a pre-battle ritual, it was hard to tell where the man ended and the animal began. The term berserker likely means bear shirt or bar shirt, referring either to the animal pelts they wore or the fact they sometimes cast off their armor and fought in a frenzy. This was not just uncontrolled rage. It was a calculated form of psychological warfare. When Harold's army advanced, the berserkers would often be at the front, and they did not march in formation. They charged, they ran at the enemy shield wall, howling, seemingly immune to fear or pain. Sagas describe them as being impervious to weapons, that blades could not cut them. This was likely an exaggeration born of terror, but the effect was real. Imagine being a farmer, conscripted to fight for a local jarl against Harold. You are standing in a shield wall. It is your job to hold the line. You are nervous, but you trust the man next to you. Then you see them. A dozen men dressed in animal skins, screaming and foaming at the mouth, charging directly at you. They are not behaving like soldiers. They are behaving like rabid animals. They ignore their own safety. They just want to get to you. The purpose of a shield wall is to present a unified front. The berserkers' job was to break that unity. They were the wedge. Their goal was to create a single moment of panic. If one man in the shield wall flinched, if he took a step back, a gap would open, and through that gap, the rest of the army would pour. The berserkers' power was the power of the inhuman. Soldiers are trained to fight other soldiers. They understand tactics, formations, and the predictable give and take of a battle line. They are not trained to fight monsters. The berserkers presented themselves as men who had shed their humanity and embraced a primal, animalistic fury. Whether this state, the berserker gang, was achieved through ritual, hallucinogenic mushrooms, or sheer psychological conditioning is still debated. But the result was the same. It terrified their enemies. It made them believe they were not fighting men, but demons in human form. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more people believed the berserkers were unstoppable beasts, the more effective they became. Number 17, they made their horns sound like the world was ending. The year was 866. The city of York, or Eoforwic, as the Anglo-Saxons called it, was in chaos. The great heathen army, a massive coalition of Vikings led by men like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, had taken the city on All Saints' Day. They had exploited the city's internal political divisions to seize it with shocking ease. Now, a Northumbrian army had arrived to take it back. The Northumbrians were confident. They breached the city's defenses and poured into the streets. They thought they had the Vikings trapped, or they were wrong. The narrow streets of the medieval city turned into a death trap. The initial advantage of numbers was lost. And then the sound began. It started as a low drone, a deep vibrating note that seemed to make the very air tremble. It was the sound of a lyre, a long curved horn made of bronze. It was an ancient instrument used in Scandinavia for centuries. In a battle, its sound was unlike anything the Anglo-Saxons had ever heard. It did not sound like a military trumpet, which was sharp and clear. The lyre's call was mournful, guttural, and vast. It sounded like the moan of some great beast. Then other sounds joined it. Dozens of horns made from cattle or goats, each with its own pitch, creating a horrifying disharmony. Then came the shouting. Thousands of Viking warriors began to scream, a unified, rhythmic roar that was not just a battle cry, but a wave of pure noise. And punctuating it all was a relentless, pounding beat. The Vikings were banging their swords and axes against the backs of their shields, creating a percussive rhythm that drove the chaos forward. This was auditory warfare. The goal was to overload the senses of the enemy. In the tight streets of York, the sound would have been deafening, echoing off the timber and stone buildings. It made it impossible for the Northumbrian commanders to give orders. It made it impossible for a soldier to hear the man next to him. All he could hear was the terrifying wall of sound coming from the enemy. This noise was not random. It was designed to trigger a primal fear. The deep horns, the rhythmic pounding, the mass screaming, these sounds mimic natural threats. They are the sounds of a rock slide, a thunderstorm, the roar of a predator. It bypasses the rational part of the brain and hits directly at the instinct for survival. It says, "You are in the presence of something powerful and destructive." The Northumbrian attack on York fell apart. The sagas say they were utterly routed. They were not just defeated by Viking axes and spears, they were defeated by sound. The Vikings had turned the city into an acoustic weapon. They created an environment where courage was difficult and panic was easy. It was a reminder that warfare is not just a physical contest, it is a contest of wills, and sometimes the most effective weapon is not a sharp piece of steel, but a terrifying noise that makes you believe the world is coming to an end. Number 16, their gods fought with them on the battlefield. In 878, a Viking army under the command of Ubba Ragnarsson landed at a place called Sinwit in Somerset, England. They laid siege to a fortification held by an Anglo-Saxon ealdorman named Odda. The situation looked bleak for the Saxons. They were outnumbered and trapped, but they had one small source of hope. They had captured the Vikings' war banner. Well, it was not just any banner. It was called the Hrefn the Raven. It was a simple piece of cloth, perhaps silk, with the image of a raven on it. But to the Vikings, and more importantly to their enemies, it was much more than that. The raven was the bird of Odin. The Odin was the Allfather, the god of war, wisdom, and death. He had two ravens, Hugin thought and Munin memory, who flew all over the world and brought him back news. The raven was a symbol of Odin's presence on the battlefield. It was believed that the banner itself had magical properties. Sagas claim that when the banner was carried into battle, if the raven on it appeared to flap its wings, it meant victory was assured. If it hung limp, defeat was certain. For the Vikings fighting under the banner, it was a direct connection to their chief god. It told them that Odin was watching. He was choosing the slain for Valhalla. This belief gave them immense courage. They were not just fighting for land or gold, they were fighting for a glorious death and a place in Odin's hall. For the Anglo-Saxons, the banner was something else entirely. They were devout Christians. To them, Odin was not a god. He was a demon. The raven was a creature of darkness, a scavenger that fed on the dead. The raven banner was a symbol of pagan evil. It was a physical manifestation of the demonic forces they believed they were fighting against. When the banner was unfurled, it was a psychological attack on the Christian soldiers. It was a declaration that this was not just a battle between men, but a battle between faiths, between God and the devil. It injected a dose of supernatural dread into the fight. At Sinwit, the Saxons having captured the banner was a huge morale boost for them and a blow to the Vikings. But the story of the banner shows the power of the symbol. The Vikings did not just bring weapons to a fight. They brought their entire cosmology. They projected their beliefs onto the battlefield. By carrying the Raven banner, they were telling their enemies, our God is here and he is a god of war. And it forced the enemy to confront not just the Viking warriors, but the entire pagan pantheon they represented. It was a way of making the battle larger than life, a cosmic struggle, and in that context, the fear felt by an ordinary soldier was magnified. He was not just facing a man with an axe, he was facing a man who believed a powerful war-like god was on his side, a man who actively sought a glorious death. That is a terrifying opponent to face. At number 15, they became the sea wolves everyone feared. The term Viking did not originally mean a person from a specific place. It was a job description. It meant to go on a raid, to be a sea rover. The men who engaged in this activity cultivated a very specific persona, the sea wolf. This was not just a name, it was a brand, a psychological weapon built on a carefully constructed identity. Consider the life of a typical Frankish or Anglo-Saxon farmer in the 9th century. His world was the land. His life was governed by the seasons of planting and harvesting. The sea was a boundary, a place of danger and mystery. It was the edge of the known world. The Vikings made that boundary their home. They were masters of the sea in a way that coastal people were not. Their longships were their homes, their transportation, and their platforms for war. They could appear from over the horizon, strike, and disappear back into the vastness of the ocean before any real defense could be mounted. They embraced this connection to the wildness of the sea. They named their ships things like Sea Serpent or Wave Walker. They adorned them with the heads of predators. They saw themselves not as soldiers in a traditional army, but as a pack of wolves hunting. Wolves are pack animals. They are relentless and they strike at the weak or isolated. This is exactly how Viking raids often worked. They did not seek out large, well-defended armies. They hit soft targets, monasteries, small towns, trading posts. This sea wolf persona was deliberately intimidating. They were men who operated outside the normal rules of society. They did not belong to any kingdom. The Franks or Saxons understood they had no fixed capital city to attack. They were a fluid, unpredictable threat, like a wolf pack. You never knew where they would show up next. This identity was reinforced by their appearance. They were often at sea for weeks or months. Their clothes would be worn, stained with salt and weather. Their beards and hair would be long and unkempt. They would look and smell like they came from a wild place. This was a stark contrast to the more settled agricultural societies they preyed upon. When a Viking raiding party landed, the villagers were not just seeing foreign soldiers. They were seeing men who seemed to be part of the untamed natural world. Men who were as comfortable in a storm on the North Sea as the farmer was in his own field. This created a sense of otherness, of facing something that was not entirely civilized. The power of this persona was that it built on existing fears. Fear of the sea, fear of the wilderness, fear of predators. The Vikings bundled all these fears together and gave them a human face. They were not just pirates. They were sea wolves, and that name, whispered in a coastal village at night, was enough to cause terror long before a dragon-headed prow ever appeared on the horizon. Number 14, a retreat was not always a retreat. In the year 885, a massive Viking fleet sailed up the River Seine. Their target was Paris. This was not a small raiding party. It was a huge force, with hundreds of ships and thousands of men, led by a chieftain named Sigfrid. The Parisians, under the leadership of Count Odo, were determined to defend their city. The Great Siege of Paris began. The Vikings tried everything. They used siege towers, battering rams, and direct assaults on the city's fortified bridges. The Franks fought back bravely, and the siege dragged on for months. The Vikings were masters of the direct, brutal assault, but they were also patient and cunning. When brute force did not work, they turned to deception. One of the most effective and terrifying tricks in their playbook was the feigned retreat. It was a tactic they used time and again, and it worked with devastating frequency. The setup was simple. After a period of intense fighting, a group of Vikings would suddenly break and run. They would appear to be in a panic, disorganized, and fleeing for their lives. For the defenders who had been under immense pressure, this was a moment of triumph. It looked like they had won. Their morale would soar. The commanders might lose control as the soldiers, eager for glory and revenge, broke formation and gave chase. This was exactly what the Vikings wanted. The chasing soldiers would leave the safety of their walls or their shield wall. They would run out into the open ground, their own lines becoming stretched and disordered. They would be focused on the fleeing enemy in front of them, not on what was happening to their sides. And then the trap would spring. The fleeing Vikings would suddenly turn and stand their ground. And from a hidden position, perhaps in a nearby patch of woods or over a small hill, a second force of Vikings, fresh and in perfect formation, would emerge and slam into the flank of the disorganized pursuers. The psychological shift was brutal. One moment, the soldiers were victorious hunters. The next, they were the trapped and surrounded prey. The elation of the chase turned instantly to the panic of encirclement. They were exposed, out of formation, and fighting on two fronts. The result was often a slaughter. This tactic worked because it exploited human nature. It played on the defenders' desperation and their desire for victory. After days or weeks of being on the defensive, the chance to finally go on the attack was intoxicating. The feigned retreat offered them that chance on a silver platter. It was a carefully crafted temptation. During the long siege of Paris, maneuvers like this would have been used in smaller skirmishes outside the city walls. Every time the Franks saw a Viking turn his back, they had to ask themselves, is this real or is it a trap? This constant uncertainty was a psychological weapon in itself. It created hesitation, it sowed distrust among the commanders and their men. A moment of hesitation on the battlefield could be fatal. The feigned retreat was not just a clever tactic. It was a way of weaponizing the enemy's own hope against them. Number 13, they attacked when God was supposed to be watching. Christian Europe in the early medieval period ran on a strict calendar. It was a calendar of holy days, festivals, and religious observations. Christmas, Easter, and the various saints' days were times of peace, prayer, and community gathering. They were times when people felt secure, both in their towns and in their faith. The Vikings understood this calendar. And they used it as a weapon. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 was just the beginning. The Great Heathen Army's capture of York in 866 happened on November 1st, All Saints' Day. This was one of the most important religious days of the year. The city would have been filled with people, and its guard would have been down. The leaders of the city, the kings of Northumbria, were distracted by a civil war. The Vikings timed their attack perfectly to exploit both the holy day and the political chaos. Attacking on a major Christian holiday was a multi-layered psychological tactic. First, there was the element of surprise. People simply did not expect a major military assault on a day reserved for worship. The defenses were relaxed, soldiers might be with their families. It was an easy practical advantage, but the deeper impact was spiritual. For the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, or the Irish, an attack on Easter Sunday was not just an attack. It was a profound act of sacrilege. It was a desecration. It was a statement by the pagan invaders that your God, your faith, and your holy days meant nothing to them. Or worse, that they were deliberately mocking them. This created a spiritual crisis for the victims. How could God allow his own holy day to be violated in such a way? How could he let his churches be looted and his followers be attacked while they were celebrating him? It planted a seed of doubt and fear. It made the Vikings seem like a force of divine punishment, or worse, a force that even God could not, or would not, stop. The Vikings also used weather and seasons to their advantage. Campaigns were typically fought in the spring and summer. Armies did not usually fight in the dead of winter. It was too cold and supplies were too scarce. But the Vikings, hardened by their Scandinavian homelands, were not a typical army. In the winter of 870, the Great Heathen Army, having conquered Northumbria and East Anglia, marched on the Kingdom of Wessex. They set up a winter camp at Reading. This was a shocking move. A large army living off the land in the middle of winter, deep in enemy territory. It defied the conventions of warfare. It sent a clear message to the Saxons of Wessex. There is no time of year you are safe. We do not follow your rules. We do not rest when you rest. By attacking on holy days and campaigning in the winter, the Vikings showed a complete disregard for the norms of their enemies. They were unpredictable. They operated on their own schedule, governed by their own needs and opportunities, not by the Christian calendar or the traditional campaign season. This unpredictability was a constant source of anxiety. The threat was always there, lurking, ready to strike when you least expected it, in the place where you felt the most secure. Number 12. They made you watch them prepare for your demise. Before a battle, a period of tension hangs in the air. Both sides are arrayed, waiting for the signal to advance. It is a moment of extreme psychological pressure. Most armies would use this time for final preparations, for speeches from their commanders, for prayers. The Vikings had their own rituals for this moment, and they were designed to be a performance for the benefit of their enemies. Imagine standing in a Saxon shield wall, looking across a field at the Viking army. They are not standing in quiet discipline. Well, they are a hive of menacing activity. You can see men sharpening their axes on whetstones, the rhythmic shing, 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 carrying across the field. The sound is deliberate, repetitive, a promise of the work that axe will soon be doing. They are not hiding their preparation, they are flaunting it. Other men might be checking the strings on their bows, fletching arrows, or polishing their helmets. But the most unsettling display was the flighting. Flighting was a ritual exchange of insults. It was a verbal duel, a contest of poetic boasting and creative taunts. A Viking champion would step forward and shout across the field, his voice full of scorn. He would mock the enemy's courage. He would insult their leader, their ancestry, their manhood. He would boast about his own past victories and describe in graphic detail what he was about to do to them. This was not just idle trash talk, it was a formal, ritualized part of their warfare. Sagas are full of examples. In Egil's saga, the hero, Egil Skallagrimsson, is a master of insulting poetry, using it to enrage and unnerve his opponents before a fight. For the soldiers on the receiving end, the flighting was deeply unsettling. It was personal. The Vikings were not just an anonymous army. They were individuals shouting threats directly at you. It was designed to provoke anger and fear. Anger was a useful emotion to provoke. An angry soldier might break ranks, charge foolishly, and disrupt the discipline of the shield wall. Fear was even better. The constant stream of boasts and threats could erode a soldier's confidence, making him second-guess himself before the first blow was even struck. The combination of these pre-battle rituals was a powerful psychological cocktail. The sight of hundreds of men sharpening their weapons was a visual threat. The sound of their war horns and rhythmic chanting was an auditory assault, and the flighting was a direct personal attack on your morale. It was all a form of theater. The Vikings were putting on a show of their own confidence and ferocity. They were projecting an image of inevitability. "Look at us," the performance said. "We are so sure of our victory that we can take our time, sharpen our blades, and tell you exactly how we are going to defeat you." For the enemy army forced to stand and watch this display of arrogant preparation, the wait for battle became an ordeal in itself. The tension would build, and with it the fear. Number 11, their weapons were designed to be heard. A Viking warrior's primary weapon was often the axe. While swords were a high-status weapon carried by chieftains and wealthy warriors, the broadaxe was the tool of the common man. It was derived from a wood-cutting tool, but it was perfected for war, and its design was as much about psychological impact as it was about physical damage. The Danish broadaxe, with its long handle and heavy, flared head, was a terrifying weapon to face. It required 2 hands to wield, meaning the user had to forsake a shield. This was a statement in itself, a commitment to pure offense. But the true terror of the axe was not just its cutting power. It was its sound. A sword makes a relatively quiet, high-pitched shing when it is drawn, and a clang when it hits a shield. An axe is different. When swung with force, the heavy head makes a deep whoosh sound as it cuts through the air. It is a sound of immense weight and power, and when it hit a wooden shield, the sound was not a clang. It was a sickening thump or a loud crack as the wood splintered. An axe could shatter a shield, leaving the man behind it exposed and vulnerable. The sound of hundreds of these axes hitting a shield wall would have been a deafening, terrifying percussion. It was the sound of destruction. Every crack was a shield failing, a defense being breached. Swords were also used to create intimidating noise. The technique of banging a sword or axe on the back of a shield was a standard part of the pre-battle auditory assault. But the Vikings took it a step further. Some Viking-age swords have been found with a patterned welded blade, where different types of iron and steel were twisted and forged together. This created beautiful, wavy patterns on the blade, but it also made the sword incredibly strong and flexible. These high-quality blades were given names like Leg Biter or Peacebreaker. A warrior's sword was his partner. He believed it had a spirit of its own. When these named high-status swords were used, they carried their own psychological weight. Facing a chieftain wielding a famous blade was more intimidating than facing a regular warrior. The weapon had its own reputation. But the most common weapon, the axe, was the true workhorse of Viking psychological warfare. It was a brutal, unsubtle weapon. It was not for fencing or delicate parries. It was for chopping, for breaking things. Its heavy, cleaving blows were meant to intimidate. A sword might leave a clean cut. An axe inflicted a devastating wound. The choice of the axe as a primary weapon says a lot about the Viking approach to combat. They favored shock, awe, and overwhelming force. The sound of the axe, the sight of it splintering a shield, and the knowledge of the damage it could do were all part of a single, terrifying package. It was a weapon that did not just defeat a man physically, it demoralized him with its sheer brutal presence. Number 10, they turned a leader's death into a spectacle. In any army, the leader is the focal point of morale. He is the symbol of their cause, the source of their orders, and the inspiration for their courage. If the leader falls, the army's will to fight often breaks. Armies in the Viking Age knew this. Assassinating or killing an enemy king or chieftain was a primary goal in any battle. The Vikings, however, were masters at turning this moment into a psychologically devastating event. The key was not just to kill the leader, but to do it in a way that the entire enemy army could see. It had to be a public, undeniable, and shocking event. Consider the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. King Harald Hardrada of Norway had invaded England. He was met by the English army of King Harold Godwinson. In the early stages of the battle, the Norwegian army was caught by surprise and was not wearing its heavy mail armor. Despite this, they fought fiercely. Harald Hardrada was a giant of a man, a legendary warrior. He stood at the front of his army, fighting in the berserker style, cutting down Englishmen with his two-handed sword. He was the heart of the Norwegian resistance. As long as he stood, his men would fight. Then an arrow struck him in the throat. Though he fell, the English army knew how important this moment was. Accounts of the battle describe a great cheer going up from the English ranks. The death of the Viking king was not a quiet affair. It was a spectacle. For the Norwegian army, the effect was catastrophic. Their larger-than-life leader, the man they had followed from Norway, the great Harald Hardrada, was dead on the ground. The central pillar of their army was gone, their morale shattered. Although they were offered quarter, they chose to fight to the death in a final, hopeless stand. The battle was lost at the moment their king fell. The Vikings used this same tactic when they were the attackers. They would deliberately target the enemy's standard bearer. The standard, or banner, was the rallying point for the army. It showed where the king was. To capture the standard was a huge blow. To kill the standard bearer and the king next to it was a decisive act. Viking champions and berserkers would often try to carve a path directly to the enemy leader. This was incredibly risky, but the psychological payoff was enormous. The sight of a small group of warriors relentlessly and successfully cutting their way toward your king was terrifying. It showed a level of ferocity and determination that seemed unstoppable. If they succeeded, they would make a show of it. Or they would raise the fallen king's helmet on a spear. They would seize his banner. They would let out a victory roar that was meant to be heard by every man on the field. This was not just about winning the battle, it was about total victory. It was about breaking the enemy's spirit so completely that they would not just retreat, they would rout. By making a spectacle of the leader's death, the Vikings were sending a clear message to every single soldier on the other side. Your cause is lost. Your leader is dead. You have nothing left to fight for. It was a brutal but highly effective way to end a fight. Number 9, they used your own people against you. The Vikings were not just mindless raiders, they were shrewd political operators. They quickly understood that the kingdoms they were raiding, England, Francia, Ireland, were not unified entities. They were patchworks of competing interests, rival kings, and simmering resentments. The Vikings became experts at exploiting these internal divisions for their own gain. When the Great Heathen Army arrived in England in 865, the country was divided into several kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. Northumbria was in the middle of a civil war between two rival claimants to the throne, Osbert and Aila. Ivar the Boneless and his brother Halfdan did not simply attack Northumbria. They observed, they waited. They saw the chaos of the civil war and used it. They marched on the capital, York, and took it easily because the Northumbrians were too busy fighting each other. When Osbert and Ahila finally decided to unite to try and retake the city, it was too late. The Vikings were dug in, and the Northumbrian army was destroyed. This was a pattern the Vikings would repeat across Europe. In Francia, the empire of Charlemagne was crumbling under his grandsons who were fighting each other for control. The Vikings sailed up the Seine, the Loire, and the Garonne, and local Frankish nobles would sometimes pay them to attack their rivals. The Vikings were happy to oblige. They became mercenaries in the internal conflicts of the people they were raiding. This was a brilliant psychological strategy. It sowed distrust and paranoia. A local lord could never be sure if the Viking fleet appearing on the river was there to raid him or if they had been hired by his neighbor. It turned the Franks against each other. It made a unified defense against the Northmen almost impossible. The Vikings also practiced the art of installing puppet rulers. After they conquered a kingdom like East Anglia or Northumbria, they did not always rule it directly. Sometimes they would find a local Anglo-Saxon noble who was willing to collaborate. They would install him as a puppet king. He would rule in their name, collect taxes for them, and keep the local population in line. For the people of that kingdom, this was profoundly demoralizing. They were not being ruled by a foreign conqueror, but by one of their own, a traitor who had sided with the enemy. It broke their sense of national or regional unity. It made them feel betrayed from within. Who could you trust? Your own leaders might be in the pay of the Vikings. By playing the political game, the Vikings magnified their threat. They were not just an external enemy. They became an internal one as well. They were a corrupting influence, a force that could turn brother against brother and king against king. This fear of internal betrayal was often more corrosive and damaging to a kingdom's morale than the fear of a straightforward raid. Or it was a quieter, more insidious form of warfare, and the Vikings were masters of it. Number 8, they could be traitors one day, raiders the next. The popular image of the Viking is one of a pure warrior, descending from a longship with an axe in his hand. This is only part of the story. The Vikings were also some of the most successful and wide-ranging traders of their age. A Viking crew might sail to England to raid a monastery and then sail to Constantinople to trade the stolen goods for silk and silver. This dual identity as both trader and raider was one of their most effective, if unintentional, psychological weapons. It made them completely unpredictable. Imagine you are the leader of a coastal town in Francia in the 9th century. A fleet of Viking longships appears on the horizon. What do? Do you arm your men and prepare for a brutal assault? Or do you send a party down to the beach to negotiate prices for furs, amber, and walrus ivory? If you guess wrong, the consequences are disastrous. If you prepare for trade, and they intend to raid, your town is undefended and will be quickly overrun. If you prepare for a fight, and they genuinely only want to trade, you have offended a powerful group of armed men and lost a valuable economic opportunity. You might even, provoke them into attacking when they had no initial intention of doing so. This ambiguity kept their enemies constantly off balance. The Vikings themselves could decide which role they wanted to play at any given moment. Their ships were designed for both trading and raiding. They could carry cargo, but they could also carry a large crew of warriors. A single vessel could be a merchant ship on the way out and a warship on the way back. There are numerous accounts of Vikings using trade as a cover for an attack. A famous, though possibly legendary, story involves the chieftain Hastein and his partner Bjorn Ironside. In the mid-9th century, they led a fleet into the Mediterranean. They wanted to sack Rome, but they mistakenly identified the Italian city of Luna as their target. Knowing they could not take the heavily fortified city by force, they resorted to trickery. Hastein sent messengers to the city's bishop, claiming that he was gravely ill and wanted to convert to Christianity on his deathbed. The bishop, eager for such a high-profile conversion, agreed. Hastein was brought into the city. Later, news arrived that Hastein did. His men asked that their great leader be given a Christian burial inside the city's cathedral. The request was granted. A procession of seemingly unarmed Viking warriors carried Hastein's coffin into the heart of Luna. Once inside the cathedral, Hastein leaped from his coffin very much alive. His men produced weapons that had been hidden in their clothes. They seized the city from within. While the details of this story may be embellished, it illustrates the principle perfectly. The Vikings used the peaceful guise of a religious ceremony to launch a surprise attack. Their ability to switch between the role of peaceful merchant, pious convert, or ruthless raider made them a deeply confusing and unsettling foe. You could never be sure of their true intentions until it was too late. Number 7. They burned the heart of your world. When the Vikings raided a monastery like Lindisfarne or Iona, they were not just attacking a building. They were attacking the intellectual, spiritual, and economic center of their enemy's society. In a largely illiterate world, monasteries were the libraries, the schools, the art studios, and the record offices. They were where history was written, where knowledge was preserved, and where the wealth of the local community was often stored for safekeeping. To burn a monastery was to burn the culture itself, and fire was a weapon the Vikings used with terrifying skill. A Viking raid on a settlement often began with fire. They would use torches to set the thatched roofs of houses ablaze. Fire spreads quickly, it creates panic and chaos, it forces people out of their homes and into the open, where the raiders are waiting. The smoke chokes and disorients, the light of the flames at night turns the familiar landscape of a village into a terrifying vision of hell. Fire is a primal fear. It is a force of pure destruction. It does not just steal, it erases. A Viking raiding party did not need to fight every single person in a village if they could use fire to do their work for them. The psychological effect of seeing your home, your church, your entire community go up in flames was devastating. It was a message of absolute power. It said, "We can not only take your things, we can wipe you from the earth." When they used fire on a monastery, the effect was even more profound. The monks who survived the raid on Lindisfarne would have seen their holy relics melted down, their precious illuminated manuscripts turned to ash. These were not just objects. They were the physical embodiment of their faith and their heritage. An illuminated Bible could take a monk his entire life to produce. To see it burn was to see a lifetime of devotion and centuries of tradition destroyed in a few minutes. This was economic warfare, spiritual warfare, and psychological warfare all rolled into one. By burning the fields before a harvest, they could threaten a region with starvation. By burning a town's mill or its stored food, they could cripple its ability to survive the winter. By burning the monastery, they destroyed the community's soul. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is filled with entries that say things like, "The army rode over the land and harried and burned." The act of burning was as important as the act of harrying. It left a scar on the landscape and on the minds of the survivors. A looted town could be rebuilt. A burned-out husk was a constant, grim reminder of the Vikings' power and their capacity for total destruction. It was a warning to every other town in the region this could happen to you. Number 6. They made the shield wall an unstoppable monster. The shield wall, or skaldborg, was a common tactic in warfare across northern Europe. The basic idea was simple soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their shields to create a solid barrier of wood and iron. It was a defensive formation designed to repel cavalry charges and absorb volleys of arrows. But in the hands of the Vikings, the shield wall became a terrifying offensive weapon. A Viking shield wall was not a static line. It was a living, breathing creature. The men in the front rank would lock their shields together. The men in the ranks behind them would add their weight, pushing forward. The entire formation would move across the battlefield like a giant armored slug, a relentless grinding force. The psychological effect of facing this was immense. Imagine you are an Anglo-Saxon soldier. You are not facing 100 individual enemies. You are facing a single, unified monster with hundreds of legs and a shell of painted shields. From behind the wall, you hear the rhythmic chanting and the pounding of weapons on shields. Spears jut out from between the shields like the quills of a porcupine. The goal of the shield wall was to create pressure. It would advance slowly, inexorably across the field. It was designed to break the enemy's nerve. The men in the opposing line would have to stand their ground as this wall of noise and steel got closer and closer. The temptation to turn and run would be enormous. If the enemy shield wall did not break, the two lines would meet with a tremendous crash. This was the moment of truth. It became a pushing match, a brutal test of strength and endurance. The Vikings excelled at this. They would use short spears to stab at the legs and faces of the men opposite them. They would use their axes to hook the tops of shields and pull them down, creating an opening. The shield wall was also a stage for individual acts of heroism and savagery, which were themselves a form of psychological warfare. A champion or a berserker might leap over the top of his own shield wall to crash into the enemy line, creating chaos. Or two leaders might engage in single combat in the space between the armies, but the true power of the shield wall was its sense of invulnerability. It presented the enemy with a problem that seemed to have no solution. Arrows bounced off the shields, or a cavalry charge would break against it like a wave on a rock. A direct frontal assault was suicidal. It forced the enemy to feel helpless, to feel that they were being crushed by a force that could not be stopped. The discipline required to maintain a shield wall under pressure was immense. The Vikings drilled and trained for this. Their social structure, based on loyalty to a chieftain and the men in your shield brother, reinforced the cohesion of the unit. The shield wall was the physical manifestation of their social bonds. To break and run was to betray your comrades. For their enemies, it was simply a monster. A slow, grinding, unstoppable monster that was coming to crush them. Number 5, their eyes held no fear and no mercy. In the heat of battle, when two warriors are face to face, the fight is often decided by psychology as much as by skill. A moment of hesitation, a flicker of fear in the eyes, can be a fatal mistake. Viking warriors understood this. They cultivated a look, a gaze that was a weapon in itself. Sagas and accounts from people who encountered them often described their eyes. They are called piercing cold, or like a wolf's. This was likely a deliberate effect. They would hold eye contact with an opponent, unblinking, showing no emotion other than cold aggression. This intense predatory stare had several psychological effects. First, it was dehumanizing. It made the Viking warrior seem less like a man and more like a predator sizing up its prey. A normal human interaction involves a range of facial expressions. A face that is a blank mask of aggression is deeply unsettling. It suggests the person opposite you is not operating by the same social rules. They are not open to negotiation, pity, or fear. Second, it was a display of supreme confidence. To hold an unblinking stare in a life or death situation says, I am not afraid of you. I am not afraid of dying. I am entirely focused on defeating you. This could create doubt in an opponent's mind. If this man is not afraid, perhaps I should be. Third, it could be a simple distraction. While an enemy soldier was locked into this intense battle of wills, focusing on the Viking's eyes, he might miss the subtle shift of weight that preceded an axe blow or the lunge of a spear. This intimidating gaze was part of a larger physical performance. The Vikings were often physically larger than the men they fought, a result of a better diet rich in protein. They amplified this natural advantage with their appearance. Long, often braided beards and hair made them look wilder, more imposing. Some are believed to have filed horizontal grooves into their front teeth, possibly filling them with colored pigment. Imagine a large, bearded warrior grinning at you from across a shield wall, revealing a mouthful of striped teeth. The effect would be utterly terrifying. Some accounts even suggest they used a black powder made from a specific type of fungus to line their eyes, similar to coal. This would have made their eyes seem more deep set and intense, accentuating their stare. All of this was about creating an aura of intimidating otherness. They did not want to look like the Frankish or Saxon soldiers they were fighting. They wanted to look like something more ancient, more primal, and more dangerous. The unblinking, merciless stare was the focal point of this persona. It was the final, personal touch in their arsenal of terror. When a Viking looked at you, he wanted you to see your own death reflected in his eyes. Number 4, they left a message written in ruin. After a successful raid, a Viking war party did not just pack up their loot and leave. They often engaged in acts of symbolic destruction. This was not random vandalism, it was a carefully calculated message, a calling card left for the survivors and for anyone else who might hear the story. It was the final act in their psychological assault. The specific nature of the destruction was important. As we have seen, burning a monastery was a powerful statement, but there were other, more personal messages they could leave. After defeating an enemy army, they would not necessarily just leave the dead on the field. The sagas, though often exaggerated, speak of them arranging the bodies of the slain in patterns, or hanging them from trees, creating a grove of the dead. This was designed to horrify anyone who found the site later. It was not enough to defeat their enemies. They had to desecrate them, to strip them of their dignity, even in death. It was a warning that the Vikings' power extended beyond the battlefield. In a settlement, they might target a specific symbol of local authority. They might pull down the chieftain's high seat in the mead hall. They might deface the altar of a church, a profound act of blasphemy that would terrify the deeply religious populace. These were not acts of military necessity. They were acts of psychological warfare designed to break the spirit of the survivors. The message was clear: we were here. We took what we wanted. We destroyed what we wanted. Nothing you hold sacred is safe from us, and we can come back whenever we choose. This tactic of leaving a terrifying calling card was part of building their reputation. The Vikings knew that stories traveled. Where a survivor from a raided village would flee to the next town and tell them what he had seen. The more horrifying the story, the better. Fear was a resource. If the reputation of a particular Viking chieftain was fearsome enough, the next town he approached might simply pay him to leave, the Danegeld, rather than risk a fight. Terror was good for business. The ruins of a sacked town or monastery served as a long-lasting advertisement for Viking ferocity. For years afterward, people would look at the burned-out timbers and the collapsed stone walls and remember what had happened there. It was a physical scar on the landscape that kept the fear alive. This strategy shows a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. The Vikings knew that the fear of an attack could be as powerful a weapon as the attack itself. By leaving a message written in ruin, they ensured that the terror of their presence lingered long after their longships had disappeared over the horizon. It poisoned the sense of safety and security for an entire region, making everyone wonder not if the Vikings would return, but when. Number 3, they knew the name of your greatest fear. In 845, the Viking chieftain Ragnar Lothbrok, a figure who is now more legend than history, led a fleet of over 100 ships up the Seine River to attack Paris. The king of West Francia, Charles the Bald, assembled an army to stop him. He made a critical mistake. He divided his army, placing one half on the north bank of the river and one half on the south bank. Ragnar saw this division and exploited it. He ignored the larger force on the north bank and launched a furious assault on the smaller southern force. The southern army was quickly overwhelmed. The northern army, on the other side of a wide river, could only watch in horror. Then Ragnar did something truly chillin'. He took 111 of his prisoners from the defeated southern army, and he had them put to death. He did this in full view of the remaining Frankish army on the opposite bank. He did it as a sacrifice to the god Odin. This was not an act of random cruelty. It was a calculated act of psychological terror aimed directly at the deepest beliefs and fears of his Frankish enemies. For the Frankish soldiers, this was a multi-layered horror. First, they were forced to watch their comrades die, helpless to intervene. This induced a profound sense of failure and impotence. Their king had failed to protect them, they had failed to protect their brothers in arms. Second, the act was framed as a pagan religious ritual. The Franks were devout Christians. To them, this was not just an execution. It was a human sacrifice to a demon. It was an act of supreme evil, a blasphemy of the highest order. It confirmed their worst fears about the Vikings, that they were not just soldiers, but servants of the devil. Third, it was a direct message to Charles the Bald and his remaining army. Ragnar was showing them what he was capable of. He was demonstrating his utter ruthlessness and his contempt for their Christian faith. He was telling them, "This is what will happen to you if you resist." The effect was exactly what Ragnar intended. The Frankish army was demoralized, their will to fight was broken, and Charles the Bald, seeing the spirit of his men collapse, did not risk a battle. Instead, he paid Ragnar a massive tribute of 7,000 pounds of silver and gold to leave. Ragnar had won a great victory, not with a major battle, but with a single horrifying act of psychological warfare. This event shows how the Vikings could tailor their terror. They were not just brutal, they were intelligently brutal. They understood what their enemies valued: their faith, the lives of their comrades, and they targeted those values directly. Not just attack their bodies, they attacked their souls. By performing a pagan sacrifice in front of a Christian army, Ragnar found the name of his enemy's greatest fear and spoke it aloud. Number 2, they made you pay for your own protection. Beginning in the late 9th century, the Vikings in England and Francia began to perfect a new and insidious form of psychological warfare extortion on a national scale. It became known as the Danegeld. The principle was simple: a Viking army would arrive, raid, and cause a certain amount of destruction. They would prove how dangerous they were. Then they would offer the local king or ruler a deal. He could pay them a huge sum of money in silver and gold, and they would leave in peace. For a while. The first major Danegeld was paid by Charles the Bald to Ragnar Lothbrok at Paris in 845. In England, the practice became systematic under King Aethelred the Unready in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The Danegeld was a psychological masterpiece. First, it was a public admission of defeat and weakness. A king's primary duty was to protect his people. By paying the Danegeld, a king was openly admitting that he could not do this. He was telling his own people that his army was too weak to fight the invaders. This eroded the king's authority and the people's trust in him. Second, it was economically crippling. The sums demanded were enormous. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records payments of 10,000 pounds of silver, then 16,000, then 24,000, and so on. To raise this money, the king had to levy heavy taxes on his own people. So the English farmers and landowners were being forced to pay to protect themselves from an enemy their own king could not defeat. This created deep resentment and internal strife. Third, and most importantly, it never worked. Paying the Danegeld was like paying a predator not to eat you. It only showed the predator where to find its next meal. A Viking army that had been successfully paid off would leave, but they would tell their friends back in Scandinavia about the rich and weak kingdom that was willing to pay tribute. Soon, another army would arrive, demanding an even larger payment. This created a hopeless cycle of fear and appeasement. Each payment made the kingdom poorer and weaker, and it made the Vikings richer, stronger, and more incentivized to return. It was a protection racket on a geopolitical level. The psychological state of a population living under the constant threat of the Danegeld was one of perpetual anxiety. They were being bled dry by their own king to pay off an enemy who would inevitably return anyway. Their leaders seemed weak, their future seemed bleak, and the dragon-headed longships were a permanent fixture of their nightmares. The Danegeld was perhaps the Vikings' most sophisticated trick. It was a way to conquer a kingdom's spirit and its treasury without having to go through the trouble of actually conquering its land. It turned the relationship between the ruler and the ruled into one of distrust and resentment. It was a slow, corrosive poison that rotted a kingdom from the inside out. Number one, they made you believe they were inevitable. The ultimate goal of all psychological warfare is to convince your enemy that resistance is futile. It is to make them believe that your victory is not just possible, but inevitable. Over the course of 3 centuries, the Vikings achieved this on a continental scale. Their various tricks, the speed of their ships, their terrifying appearance, their brutality, their cunning tactics all combined to create a single overwhelming impression. The Vikings could not be stopped. This sense of inevitability was their greatest weapon. It began with their first raids. They appeared from nowhere, struck with impunity, and disappeared. They defied geography. They could not be contained. When kingdoms tried to build defenses, the Vikings simply went around them, sailing up a different river. Then they showed they could defeat armies in open battle. They conquered and settled vast territories, the Danelaw in England, Normandy in France, the city-states of the Rus in the east. They were not just raiders anymore. They were nation builders, conquerors. They demonstrated that no institution was safe. They sacked the holiest monasteries. They besieged the greatest cities like Paris and Constantinople. They showed that no leader, no matter how powerful, was a match for them. They killed kings in battle and forced others to pay them humiliating tribute. This relentless, centuries-long string of successes built a fearsome reputation. The stories of their deeds, certainly exaggerated with each telling, spread ahead of them. By the 10th century, the appearance of a Viking fleet on the horizon was often enough to cause a panic. The battle was half lost before it began, because the people had been conditioned to believe that the Vikings always won. This belief became a self-fulfilling prophecy. A demoralized army fights poorly. A terrified population will not mount a spirited resistance. A king who believes he will lose is more likely to pay tribute than to risk a fight. The Vikings' reputation did much of their work for them. This idea of inevitability was the culmination of all their other tricks. The berserkers' charge was a small-scale performance of unstoppable fury. The advancing shield wall was a picture of relentless forward motion. The practice of campaigning in winter and on holy days showed that they operated outside of normal constraints. The Danegeld proved that even the richest kings would eventually bend to their will. It was a myth, of course. The Vikings were not inevitable. They were defeated many times. Alfred the Great beat them at the Battle of Edington, where they were repelled from Paris. Their invasion of England in 1066 ended in a catastrophic defeat at Stamford Bridge. They were, in the end, just men. But for a very long time, they managed to convince a large part of the world that they were something more. A force of nature, a divine punishment, a tide that could not be turned back. And in the minds of the terrified monks, farmers, and soldiers who saw the dragon-headed ships coming for them, that belief was as real and as dangerous as any steel axe. The final and most chilling trick was that they made the world believe in the Viking myth, and in doing so, they made the myth come true.